All right, guys, we are converting the UglyTruck basically into a drag truck. It's got a turbo big block under the hood, and right now we're in the middle of a rear suspension overhaul that is hopefully going to make this thing stick to the ground, and maybe with enough power and enough traction, we can get those front wheels off the ground on a properly prepared surface and a good launch. I know that's a lot to ask from an extended cab truck, especially with one that has a boat anchor up front, but hey, we've got goals, and I think hopefully by the time this project is done, we can run in the 8s in the quarter mile. Remember, we have a 547-inch turbo big block that's in the works to replace the 496 cubic inch 8.1 that's currently in there, and I have a goal of about 1,500 horsepower. So in theory, we'll have enough power to do that, but we just have to have the rest of the chassis sorted out so we can actually put all that power down to the ground. So to make that happen, we have a few parts that we're kind of in the middle of installing right now. We're doing caltracs. That's kind of like the one traction device that's going to make this all work, hopefully. But to get those installed, we're lowering the truck a total of 6 inches from stock with a spring under kit. So we're using a Caltrac spring purge, a stock GM leaf spring, and then of course the Caltrac axle bracket underneath all that. And then in terms of dampening this, we've got some Viking double adjustable shocks that are going to be going on the back of the axle. That's thanks to a kit from Atomic Fab and Performance. I think we'll get to that today. And then finally, just because of how low we're going, we had to get a C-notch welded in there. And this is what I've been working on this afternoon. I just wanted to get the driver's side done. You guys saw me do the passenger side C-notch. So now this side is done, and in terms of what work we have left to do, like I said, we'll probably start with the shock mounts, and then I think I'd like to get some sort of a coating on this frame. I know in the last video I said I probably won't, but I don't know, we've come this far and it's just going to bug me, I think. It'll still bug me, like even if I paint the back half, it'll bug me that the front half isn't painted, but at least like that's an inaccessible part that I can kind of push off for another day. So at least I think by the time we're all said and done, from the cab backwards, we'll have everything painted up and looking real good. Now, before we get to work, there is one thing I wanted to address about the way that I did the C-notch installation, which probably wasn't the most correct way to do it, and I don't think I'll actually have any problems because of it, but just sort of like a PSA, I guess. A couple of you guys brought this up in the comments, and to be honest, I didn't even think of it because I have done a couple of C-notches this way without having any problems at all, but that doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. So basically, when I installed the notch, I put my side plate on there, I kind of traced out where to cut the frame, and I just cut the frame. Now, you probably should have something to support the back end of the frame. Now, granted, the springs aren't on it, there's no spare tire, and the only, other than the frame itself, the only like weight is kind of the bumper, which, I mean, that's probably another 40 pounds or so. And I only ever do one side at a time, but theoretically, it is possible, you know, when I made that cut there without having any reinforcement on there, it is possible that the frame can whoop, drop down just a little bit. So in the future, if I had to do this job all over again, I would probably just take a piece of scrap material and kind of weld it to the, you know, tack weld it to the frame and let it go down to the ground. That way it just provides a little bit of support, so there's no possible way that that bumper or any of the weight of the frame could sag down. Now, like I said, I have done several C-notches without supporting the frame. And again, I'm not saying it's the right way to do it, but I've never had any problems with like the bed not lining up. There's a first time for everything, so I guess we'll find out. And the trick is what we're gonna have to look for when we put the bed back on. Like if there's a big old wide gap here and a really narrow gap there, well, basically that tells me whenever I cut the frame, it just kind of whoop, dropped way down. Like I said, I kind of took some measurements and just kind of eyeballing it. I'm fairly confident nothing actually moved, but it's a risk and it's something that, like I said, just because you can do it doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. Now, let's say I do get the truck put back together and the frame is a little bit crooked and the bed gap doesn't line up right. There are a couple of fixes. I could either, you know, completely cut that out and redo it, or I could even go through here and like put a couple of spacers on these last couple of bed mounting holes, and that would kind of bring the back end of the bed up. So just something to think about. Like I said, I'm fairly confident that we're not going to have those problems, but that doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. So learn from my mistakes, I guess. Let's get to work. Okay, so I think I have all of the cutting and fab work and welding done on the frame, and really the only welding that we have left to do is where the spring perches and the shock mounts are going to attach to the axle, but I'm going to wait to do that until I have the springs in and kind of some weight on there to make sure everything is sitting exactly where it's going to be, like at its final ride height, rather than just guessing. We started out by taking off the bumper and the exhaust and a few just little clips and things like that, because I am going to be coating the frame and those just would get in the way, and it gives me a little bit more room to work. And then we got the shocks, kind of the upper shock mounts anyway, burned onto the frame, and I basically took the shock, I put it halfway through its travel, I cranked the adjusters to the firm setting, so basically the shock isn't going to move. And then I more or less just kind of, with the axle at roughly ride height, I kind of picked a good spot for the upper mounts. In terms of ride height, this little paint sticker right here, this is where the bottom of the frame used to be. And obviously the bump stop was bolted to the bottom of the frame. And then before there was about a 2-inch gap between the bottom of the bump stop and the axle, where now it is touching. So that's kind of how I figure where the axle is going to be, roughly 2 inches lower than before. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be super accurate, so that's why I'm going to wait to weld the spring perches and the lower shock mounts in. Because, like I said, pinion angle, that's going to change. We need to make sure. I've got just a couple of blocks holding up the yoke now. It's sort of roughly close, but we want to make sure we nail that exactly before we weld the spring perches in. And then the lower shock brackets, kind of the same thing. I want the shocks halfway through their travel at ride height, and then we'll just kind of figure out where the brackets need to go, because if you roll it up or down, that could change, where the shock's going to go in its travel. And I don't want them to bottom out, but I also don't want them to top out, if we go over a bump or something. So, like I said, we'll just basically wait till I get the springs in and some weight on there to finalize the position. I do have the upper brackets going downhill by about 8 degrees, and those brackets go uphill. So we're kind of splitting the difference. I was thinking it'd look nice if the upper brackets were level with the frame. You can see they go downhill, but if I did that, these would be nice and level, and the bottom ones would be kind of cranked uphill quite a bit. So I figured it would look better if the angle were sort of shared. And I think that's kind of how it's going to look, its final position. And I'm really liking how the Vikings look. And when everything's painted up, semi-gloss black, it'll be cool to look under there and see, a shiny billet aluminum shock body. Spacing from the... Oh, speaking of spacing, before I get to that, I always do take an extra washer and put it in between these brackets when I weld something on. These are the actual bushings that came with the shock, so that was kind of my baseline, and then I add a little bit with a washer just because if I've done it before where I don't have any extra space, and when you tighten the bolt down just to kind of weld everything in, then it seems like when you go to put the shock in, for some reason it's just a little bit too tight, where this way it's just about perfect. The shock will now slide in exactly how it should. We welded these in on both sides, the inner and the outer, which is probably overkill, but whatever. I'd rather have it overkill than worry about a weld breaking. Anyway, that's the final position of the shocks, the uppers, not the lowers. I did take some time to kind of repair these guys. When I cut them off, I cut the X's and the rivet heads, and that did leave a couple of grooves that I just kind of welded there. I enlarged the holes to 1/2 inch instead of, I think they were like a 10 millimeter rivet before, but now we're at a 1/2 inch, and I have grade 8 hardware for those guys. Basically, the reason I had to do some other repairs is when I had to cut these rivets off back when I lowered the truck, I couldn't get my cutoff wheel into these upper ones, so what I did is I just kind of sliced this frame bracket in a few places and bent it back, which allowed me to get a chisel and a hammer and a cutoff wheel to remove those. But now I put it back and I welded everything, and so these will be just as good as new. And now, let's see, that's kind of where we're at, guys. So now I'm not looking forward to this, but I'm going to kind of wire wheel this frame as best I can, then we're going to hit it with some paint. to get this project finished up, I ended up having to stay up until like 1 in the morning last night. So this is definitely a time-consuming part of the project. It's like totally my least favorite thing to do. It makes a huge mess in the shop. I mean, anytime you get the wire wheel out and you attack rust, you get dust everywhere. You know, it's not good for your lungs. Of course, I do wear a respirator anytime I'm doing stuff like this. But even so, I feel like there's a little bit that still winds up getting, you know, either around the mask, through your nose, or whatever. But anyway, the job is now done. And yeah, it does look good, I will admit that. This is a semi-gloss black, although I will say it is a little bit shinier than I kind of would have hoped. But flat black just looks like a wood stove to me, and I don't really love the look of that. So I guess I can't complain too much because it looks so much better than it did before. Now I can kind of bolt the spring hangers on, get the fuel tank back up in place, and then I can work on the suspension to kind of get this thing a little bit further along. The axle, yeah, I am going to have to do something similar to the axle, although at least now we got the majority of the work done. And anything like an axle can be removed at any point. And who knows, I might end up swapping to something like a 9-inch in the future just to kind of get more gear options and more strength. Because remember, 1,500 horsepower goal, sticky tires. I know these 8.6 10 bolts can hold up to a fair amount of abuse, but we may end up upgrading. I don't know. This whole project over the course of the next year is going to totally snowball out of control because we've got the bigger motor, and as soon as we get that in, I think everything that I've done up to this point is going to have to be redone. So I'm going to have to redo the fuel system, redo the turbo setup. We're going to redo the transmission, probably swap it out for something like maybe a turbo 400. We're going to have to cage the truck. We're going to have to, like, literally everything that we've done so far is going to get replaced and upgraded. So I'm kind of looking forward to it, actually. Like, I know it's a ton of work and it's a ton of expense, but it's going to be fun, and I can't wait to get this truck on the track in its final configuration. But we are going to actually go back to the track, if it all works out, with the stock engine, but with my good suspension. I'll have to get some slicks before we swap that out. I'm kind of curious to see how quick it will be with a lot of grip and with the two-step and the good converter, because last time we went to the track, it was kind of disappointing, I'll be honest, for how much power the truck made. We did not get a good launch. So anyway, back to the frame stuff here. The product that I used is just this Rust-Oleum semi-gloss that I picked up from Lowe's. It's like $5 a can. It's decent quality. I've used it before. I would have preferred to use Steel It here. This is a really good product. It's much thicker and it covers pretty good, but the bad thing is this stuff is like $32 a can. I ended up using about, I think, 5 cans of this stuff in total. So yeah, that would have been a little bit pricey. And on top of that, like I can't get that stuff locally. There's no retailers that I've seen that carry it. So I would have had to wait. It's about a week out by the time I order it. And I didn't have a week to wait on this project. And I kind of decided at the last minute that I wanted to get a coating on it. Like I said, the Rust-Oleum, it is semi-gloss. It's a little glossier than I would have hoped, but it's pretty darn good and close enough. So that's what we used. Also, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, I grabbed everything from Lowe's. This was probably one of the better investments I could have made, this plastic sheet, because it caught just about all the overspray that was directly under the frame. I probably should have put more on the floors here, but I think I've already swept the floor once or twice, and I think a lot of this stuff will come up over time just as we walk on it and stuff like that. But anyway, that's where we're at, guys. I'm glad I took the time to do it, although it is a huge pain in the butt. So next time, we're going to get everything kind of bolted back together. We're going to work on the caltracs. We'll get the springs back under the truck. And then we do have to do some work on the bottom of the bedside to notch the, there's a reinforcement rail that goes right through here. We're going to have to notch that out to clear these, to clear the C-notch, although we're not going to have to cut the bed floor. So that's just one more thing that we have to do. We'll get the exhaust back on, get the bumper back on. So we are making headway, and that's what you can expect to see next time. I do want to say thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Do me a favor, comment, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. We'll catch you again in another couple days, guys. Thanks for watching.